Greetings and welcome to this continued discussion of The Merchant of Venice. Today we're going to be taking a look at Act 2, specifically in this particular video. We're going to be looking at scenes 1 through 5. So Merchant of Venice Act 2. What is Act 2 all about? Well, here's kind of a summary of what it's about. I think as we take a look at Act 2, I think we can say that it's an act that is about a bunch of losers and perhaps a winner. And what do I mean by losers? I mean people who lose things. As we go straight through this act, we'll see that Shylock is going to lose Launcelot, his servant, to the Christian Bassanio. We'll see that Morocco will lose his chance to win Portia as he makes his selection at the chests. We'll see Jessica losing her Jewish faith as she escapes the home of Shylock to be with Lorenzo and the Christians. And of course, in order to do this, she is going to have to become Christian herself. We'll see Aragon, the second, to lose his chance to win Portia as he takes his chance at the chests. Shylock will lose both his ducats and his daughter at the same time. And we will see the scene where he screams about losing both. We find out that potentially Antonio has lost a ship, and possibly also Bassanio, who has now set sail to go woo and potentially win the hand of Portia. The winner in this, and I put quotation fingers around this, is Launcelot, perhaps, whose plan from the beginning of the act is to leave the service of the Jew to work for Bassanio. And as we find out, Launcelot, when he approaches Bassanio, he gains his suit. So in fact, Launcelot wins. So let's dive into the scenes. And we're going to start, obviously, by taking a look at Act 2, Scene 1. And in Act 2, Scene 1, we get our first glimpse inside Belmont and the opportunity for suitors to Portia to take their opportunity for selecting the correct chest to win Portia's hand in marriage. So we are in Belmont, and we meet Morocco for the first time. We've heard he's coming, and we heard that in Act 1, Scene 2, and we heard how Portia responded when she heard that a prince from Morocco was coming. And she brings up the very issue of the color of his skin, the race issue, back in Act 1, Scene 2. And this is addressed right away by Morocco himself as Act 2, Scene 1 begins. And these are his lines. The first thing he says to Portia: "Mislike me not for my complexion, the shadowed livery of the burnished sun, to whom I am a neighbor and near bred. Bring me the fairest creature northward born, where Phoebus's fire scarce thaws the icicles, and let us make incision for your love, to prove whose blood is reddest, his or mine. I tell thee, lady, this aspect of mine hath feared the valiant. By my love, I swear, the best regarded virgins of our clime have loved it too. I would not change this hue, except to steal your thoughts, my gentle queen." So the entirety of Morocco's first speech has everything to do with the color of his skin and where he comes from. And he explains, how he gets the color of his skin. But he also talks about other potential suitors and people he wouldn't know, but obviously presumes that there are other suitors. And he suggests that let's take a knife and cut both of our skins open, and we'll see what color the blood is. Who's reddest, his or mine, and essentially suggesting that below the skin, the color is the same. He also props himself up a bit by saying that his look, the very darkness of his skin, has actually caused people to be afraid of him, the valiant to be afraid, and that many women have loved the color of his skin in the past. So he is, suggesting, of course, that he is quite the ladies' man, and Portia should feel the same. And so there's our introduction to Morocco. Keep in mind that as this scene begins, in the back of your mind, remember who your audience is that's watching this in 1597. Okay, the audience that's watching this in 1597 is an Anglican white audience sitting at the various theaters in and about London to watch this play. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Portia's response to Morocco is interesting because she is a master of words, and we'll see this later on in the play as well. In a lot of ways, I compare her to Juliet because Juliet too is a master of her words in Romeo and Juliet. She has the ability to speak to her father, um, words that make him think she means one thing when in fact she means something completely different. And that's a talent, that's a skill, that's a person who's very, very smart. And Portia is too. And so her response to Morocco reads like this, and pay close attention to these words, because in fact, the words that Morocco hears are not the words that she means. She says to him in response, "In terms of choice, I am not solely led by nice direction of a maiden's eyes. Besides, the lottery of my destiny bars me the right to voluntary choosing. But if my father had not scanted me and hedged me by his wit, to yield myself his wife who wins me by that means I told you, yourself, renowned prince, then stood as fair as any comer I have looked on yet for my affection." And Morocco very graciously, "Even for that, I thank you." And that's where we have this head slap. Because here's what the audience knows. When Portia says, "You, fair renowned prince, stood as fair as any comer that I've looked on yet," what do we know about the other people that she has looked upon? Well, we heard about them in scene two. And what happened was Nerissa named them, and Portia proceeded to eviscerate all of them verbally. She hated all of them. And so essentially, what she is saying here, the words that she means are, "You're just like everybody else I've seen." But the words that Morocco hears are not that. The words Morocco hears are, "You're the best I've seen." Right? And that's just simply not true. He doesn't even realize what she's just said to him. The brilliance of the use of language here on Portia's part, of course, directed by the bard Shakespeare himself. So there's Portia's response to him. Portia very much does not want Morocco to win at this game. And nor, to be honest, nor does the audience. Right here, we've got a little tension going on here in this audience because of the potentiality of of um, of what might occur here should Morocco win. We learn just a little bit more in lines 40 through 49 about the means that Portia can be won. The information here is released slowly through this text, so we have to pick up a little bit at a time. We learn some in scene Act 1, Scene 2. We learn some here in this scene with Morocco, and we will learn the rest of it with Aragon, whom we'll meet in a little bit. So here's what we learn more about how to win Portia. Um, Portia says, "You must take your chance and either not attempt to choose at all or swear before you choose." If you choose wrong, never to speak to lady afterward in way of marriage. Therefore, be advised. Morocco says, nor will not come bring me unto my chance. And Portia then says, well, first, forward to the temple, and after dinner your hazard shall be made. Good fortune, then, he says, to make me blessed or cursed among men. So one of the conditions that we now learn is that if you are going to, you must swear some sort of an oath, and part of that oath includes that if you are going to do this, you swear that should you fail from this point forward in the rest of your life, you never woo another woman towards marriage. It's one and done. It's one and done. And to ensure that, right, Portia brings the people who are going to take their chance to temple, to church, to swear an oath before God, which becomes very important. Another thing to consider here, and we've been looking at this, is a return to blank verse, and you can tell because it's not right justified. And last time we saw Portia speaking, she was with Nerissa. She was speaking in prose, interestingly enough. And here, as we begin this act, and Morocco speaks first, we see that the language that's being used is the language of the upper class. And so it's interesting at this point to consider what's going on, because generally the upper class bring up the language of the lower class. And by class, it could be social, right? And so when we take a look at Nerissa and Portia's Act 1, Scene 2, and we see Nerissa and Portia are speaking in prose, and it is the higher that brings up the lower, and they're both speaking prose, the suggestion, of course, is that both are lower, certainly social rank, because they're women. And here, as this begins, we see that Morocco is speaking in verse because he's a prince. And Portia speaks in blank verse as well. Though the question is this because Morocco's in the room and she is brought up higher? But it's an interesting thing to consider as we move forward. We move to Act 2, Scene 2, and from there, and we move into Venice. And we get to meet Launcelot for the first time, Shylock's servant as we meet him, certainly for the moment. This is a complex scene. It's an interesting scene that bears scrutiny because it's a scene that begins alone with Launcelot, and it ends with Bassanio and Gratiano alone. So the scene doesn't change, but the characters in the scene do, which is interesting in and of itself. The scene location does not change. This scene begins with Launcelot's soliloquy, a famous Shakespearean soliloquy. And what he's doing here as this scene begins is he's having a battle with his conscience. He's speaking to himself. And what he's wrangling with, what he's trying to understand in his brain is whether or not he should stay in the service of the Jew Shylock, whom he says in this scene is treating him poorly. And he's considering whether or not he should leave Shylock to go work for a Christian. Specifically, it's going to be Bassanio. And what we see here Launcelot do is really speak out loud one of the central issues of the play, and that is the struggle between the Christians and the Jews, right? And the difference of the faiths. And I'm not suggesting that Shakespeare in this play is necessarily coming up right out and placing one above the other. I think he has to be very, very careful, regardless of what his own personal opinions will be, to make sure that he does not alienate an audience, and perhaps even put himself in personal jeopardy by in a very Anglican world by suggesting things that might be considered a heresy. But at the very least, this is one of the things that's at the heart of this play, and Launcelot says those words out loud. Now, you remember, Launcelot is going to be likely the lowest character socially that we meet here, other than perhaps his father, who we meet here in this scene as well. Ultimately, Launcelot's conscience tells him that he needs to leave. It's about faith. And Launcelot says, certainly my conscience will serve me to run from this Jew, my master. The fiend is at mine elbow and tempts me. Those are some powerful words, right? The idea that because of his Jewish faith, Shylock is a fiend, and one who tempts, right? Now, who tempts? Satan tempts, right? The devil tempts. And so this connection between Shylock, the Jewish faith, and that which is evil happen here. And this is what seems to be at the heart of Lancelot's struggle. Right now, Lancelot obviously needs the employment because of his station in life. Right, it's his source of income, so it's very, very important to him. And it's not always the easiest thing in the world to leave one secure job to perhaps find another. And so he's wrangling with a decent amount here as this scene begins. The scene continues with Lancelot, and it gets even more complex as Lancelot's father, who's called Old Gobbo in the play, and it's not completely clear why this is happening, but Old Gobbo has arrived to present Shylock with a gift. Sorry for the spelling typo. With a gift of doves. This scene is designed to be comical, I think, as Lancelot initially tries to trick his father, who's a blind old man, and also doesn't seem to be completely in control of his own mental faculties. But Old Gobbo doesn't seem to recognize his son, and perhaps it's been some time since they've seen each other. And so Lancelot tries to trick his father into because he doesn't know it's his son. And what we have here is a biblical allusion, a parallel to what happens in Genesis 27 when the old blind Isaac, who's dying, calls for his son Esau, and he doesn't recognize him. And he feels for his beard, and he doesn't recognize the beard either. And this is exactly what happens with Lancelot and Gobbo. So it has some comic value to it. It isn't laugh out loud funny. So it's a very heavy kind of a humor, which is exactly the type of thing that we're getting in this problem play, this play that finds itself in the genre of comedy that doesn't quite feel like a comedy. What you get here, of course, is an Old Testament reference using a character who is fleeing in Lancelot, the old Jew, right? The Old Testament. And we have a New Testament reference as Bassanio, right, becomes projected as Lancelot's savior, if you will, right? Because Bassanio is the person that Lancelot wants to run to aid his conscience, and so Bassanio can even be seen as a type of. Now, I'm not suggesting that he's Christ-like at all, but certainly, this illusion of turning from evil and running towards the light, and the light is Bassanio. The dramatic irony here, and again, dramatic irony, remember, dramatic irony is when the audience knows something that the characters do not. The dramatic irony here is that Lancelot doesn't know that Bassanio has no wealth and that he's a fraud. And the only money that Bassanio has is that which he has borrowed, which, of course, is against Christian teaching. And what Lancelot is fleeing is the Jew who is a man of wealth, who can support Lancelot in service. We know that, and he's leaving that to move to the fraud. And so there's the dramatic irony that's ensuing in this. Continuing here, we have Bassanio, who now will enter the scene. And what we're going to get is some more comedy that ensues, and perhaps even more lighthearted than what we saw with Lancelot and old Gobbo in their exchange. And what we get here and this is a common element that Shakespeare uses in his plays, especially with the lower comic characters, and that's the idea of malapropism. It's a great literary term, malapropism. It's what does it mean? The mistaken use of one word in place of a similar sounding one, often with unintentional, amusing effect. So Shakespeare makes use of words. Or has characters make use of words incorrectly, sometimes confusing words. I think of Julius Caesar at the beginning with soul and soul, SOLE, and SOUL, with the cobbler scene right at the beginning of Julius Caesar. This is how Shakespeare employs clever use of words. But here the malapropism is going to come from old Gobbo, who, of course, would use words incorrectly. Um, but what we have is Bassanio enters the scene, and we've got Lancelot and old Gobbo stumbling over words between the two of them as Lancelot attempts to gain the service. To gain employment and service of Bassanio, and old Gobbo, when words have been exchanged, and Bassanio doesn't seem to understand what's going on, and old Gobbo says to him, "That is the very defect of the matter, sir." And of course, the irony here is in the word defect. Defect's not the right word. The word, of course, should be effect. But in using the word defect, what Gabo does essentially is changes the meaning of this sentence. That's the problem, right? That's the problem of the matter, sir. And the irony, of course, is that there is a glaring defect to Lancelot's plan, and that is he's leaving a rich guy for a poor guy. Right, a funny meme here. Malapropism, cookie batter, right? And so that's what we get here with the scene. Continuing along, Lancelot and old Gobbo will exit because Lancelot will win his suit, and Bassanio will accept him into his employ, allowing now Lancelot to be able to tell Shylock that, hey, I quit. That will We actually won't see him do that, but we will see what ensues immediately following that. Lancelot and Olgabo exit, and Gratiano enters, and what we hear here is some continued, I think, levity with Gratiano. Remember, who's a little wild and crazy. We know that Bassanio has now acquired the 3,000 ducats and is putting together his plan and his posse, if you will, to head off to woo Portia. And Gratiano has come because he wants to go. Yeah, he doesn't want to be left out of the party. And so he's there, and he asks, Bassanio, "Dear Bassanio, please let me come with you," right? But Bassanio's concerned, right? Bassanio says, "Thou art too wild, too rude, and too bold of voice." Bassanio's concerned, right? Because the place that they're going is a place of high society, where rules and regulations are in place about the way people are supposed to behave. And Gratiano's a wild card in that space. You never know what he's going to say. He is wild and crazy. And Bassanio is concerned. He says, I'm a little bit afraid that you might ruin things for me with your behavior. And Gratiano responds essentially saying, "I promise I won't swear too much," right? "I promise I won't swear too much." Um, and in fact, what ends up happening is that Gratiano is ultimately allowed to come right with him. One of the things that becomes interesting, that I put here, what's happening to the language in this long scene, is that it moves. Right, it moves from blank verse into. I'm sorry, it moves from prose at the beginning of this scene into blank verse. As old Gobbo exits with Lancelot, the language changes, and Bassanio and Gratiano speak in blank verse. So we have a shifting again of language based on who's in the room, right? Who's on the scene, and the language is elevated once Lancelot and old Gobbo leave. So clever use of language from Shakespeare. Continued. We move into scene 3, and we are in Venice, but now we are at Shylock's house. Very, very powerful scene. In brief, nothing about this is funny. Right? There's nothing comedic about it at all. In fact, it's quite heavy. We meet Jessica. The audience meets Jessica for the first time. And what she has is a brief exchange with Lancelot, because has told her his plans to leave their household. A person, right? Lancelot's a member of their household, and Jessica is saddened by this. She apparently has a good relationship with Lancelot, and so they exchange niceties, and she's saddened by it. And once he leaves, we hear from Jessica what life has been like for her in Shylock's household, and she says these lines: "Alack, what heinous sin is it in me to be ashamed to be my father's child? But though I am a daughter to his blood, I am not to his manners. O Lorenzo, if thou keep promise, I shall end this strife, become a Christian, and thy loving wife." Jessica doesn't approve of her father Shylock's behaviors. She acknowledges she's his blood, but suggesting, of course, that her existence in Shylock's household is not and has not been a good one. An interesting thing happens here as we start to see a parallel between some of the characters, and let's take a look at the female characters. We've got Portia, who is single, not married, and you would have thought that her father would have had her married off by now, but he fails to do so, and we can ask the question why that's the case, and we may not get an answer because he is dead. But we can look at Jessica too and ask the very same question, because it seems that Jessica is clearly of marrying age, and regardless of the fact that whether you're talking the Christians or the Jews, it's still the duty of the father and the expectation of the father to marry off the daughter to someone of an appropriate station. And Shylock has not done this with Jessica. We don't see this. And we can question why, but I think that becomes clear as we start to think about Shylock and how he feels about his possessions, and perhaps Jessica gets lumped in simply with things that he possesses and things that he doesn't want to lose because he enjoys just the possession of them. Language in this scene, this is a fascinating thing too, because when we meet Jessica, and you would think that not only is Jessica female, she's Jewish. So, as far as the social ladder is concerned, socially, she would even rank below Lancelot. Jessica speaks only in blank verse. Jessica speaks in poetry, which is remarkable. What are we supposed to make of that? That a character of this stature is speaking in blank verse, and maybe it has something to do with her intentions, which is to leave the Jew, her father, and indeed the Jewish faith, to become a Christian. And perhaps that's why she gets afforded blank verse. But it's even more than blank verse, because what we see her do here at the end of these lines, she's also rhyming at the end. She finishes with a heroic couplet. Now, right, the heroic couplet is generally used for very important things. It's frequently used as the language of love, right? Romeo and Juliet speak couplets back and forth with each other all the time, or things that are being used to suggest that this is a very, very important moment. Shakespeare likes to use couplets there. Um, but it's interesting to consider this, that a character of this stature, when we met Portia and Nerissa, they were speaking in prose, right? And here we have Jessica, the female Jew, who is speaking in poetry. Scene 5 is I'm calling it a plot setup scene. It's also a brief scene, and it does serve to advance the plot, I think. And you need these, right? Shakespeare needs these types of things to keep the plot connected and moving together. And I think that's what happens here. And what we get here is this in this brief scene. Lancelot has delivered a letter to Lorenzo that has come from Jessica. And in it, Jessica tells Lorenzo that, look, my father's not going to be home tonight. He's going to be out dining with Bassanio. He's going to be leaving his house to go eat with the Christians, which is interesting because when we met Shylock back in Act 1, Scene 3, um, Shylock says these lines: I will not eat with you, drink with you, nor pray with you. And here we find, not too soon after that, Shylock is in fact going to dine with the Christian, right? What's up with that? Why the quick change? How does this advance Shylock's purposes? Of course, the plan for the boys, and by the boys I mean Lorenzo and the gang, is to rescue Jessica from Shylock's house. And I use the word steal because if in fact Shylock has treated Jessica like one of his possessions, then in fact it is a theft. And this is going to happen during the mask. And I have a definition here for you of the mask, right? It's a short, obviously, for masquerade, which is an elaborate party that people wore masks at. And this is generally this is not something that the Jews would have partaken in. It's something that the Christians would do. If you think of the parties that are held on Fat Tuesday, right, the day before Lent, the idea of Fat Tuesday is, in Lent is a very sobering time when people are supposed to enter the desert and repent for their sins. And what happens on Fat Tuesday the night before is, well, if we're going to enter the desert and we're going to spend a lot of time repenting for our sins, we might as well get a whole bunch out of our system the night before. And so masks are something that can generally be accompanied by something like this. I think of the masks that are worn in Edgar Allan Poe's Cask of Amontillado. Right, there's a party going on upstairs, and there's a masquerade party. It's the same. It's the same idea. People wore masks during these parties, during these revelries, with the idea that if you're wearing a mask, you can behave in any manner that you want because nobody really is going to know your identity because you have a mask on, right? And so you can get away with a lot wearing a mask. Now, the thing about the masks, and you can see some examples of masks here that are very much masks from masquerade parties that date back a long time. If somebody's wearing this, you know who's behind the mask, right? So while you can behave and you might feel free to behave in a in a raucous way, the fact of the matter is everybody knows who it is anyways, right? So it's the Christian here that are partaking in the parties, but Shylock, the rest of the sober Jews, would never do anything like this. And that's the scene that we see here in scene 4. Scene 5, and the last scene we're going to take a look at in this video, is in Venice, and it's at Shylock's house. And in this scene, we learn that Shylock has been told by Lancelot that Lancelot's going to leave to work for Bassanio. So we start this scene on medias res, which is an uncommon, and so that's already occurred. And and Shylock's lines to Lancelot are interesting, right? Shylock knows what Lancelot's getting into. And he knows that because he's the one who's lent Bassanio his money. Shylock knows Bassanio's a fraud. But he doesn't mind that Lancelot's leaving. He calls him lazy. Whether he is or not, we don't know. Maybe it's just sour grapes. But Shylock lets him know. He says, you'll see, you'll see, as Shylock says to Lancelot without really giving it away. What we know here immediately following is that Shylock is going to supper with the Christians, and as referred in the previous scene. And Shylock says, when he lets Jessica know that he doesn't really want to do this at all. She says, I am not bid for love. I don't do this because I like them. They flatter me. But yet I'll go and hate to feed upon the prodigal Christian. Jessica, my girl, look to my house. I am right loath to go. There is some ill a brewing towards my rest, for I did dream of money bags tonight. Shylock doesn't feel quite right. He feels as though something's out of whack. And he talks about, he had dreams of his money. Well, of course he had. Is a surprise that Shylock dreams of money, but this particular dream of money caused him some unrest, and of course it certainly is foreshadowing, because later on this night Jessica will steal a chest full of Shylock's gold, jewels, and ducats, to leave with Lorenzo. So it's prophetic on Shylock's part. He doesn't know it yet, obviously, but there's definitely foreshadowing of what's about to happen later on in the scene. Lancelot warns Shylock, and this is perhaps an act of kindness in this scene, that there will be masks tonight, and this causes Shylock distress, because Shylock is not about the masks. He's not about being a part of those wild parties that the Christians have, where there's tremendous debauchery, and people wear masks, and he's going to be a part of it. And Shylock is just disheartened by the fact that he knows he's going into this, and he leaves with very specific instructions for Jessica: lock up the house. Don't look outside. I don't want you to see the revelers that might be outside. I want to protect my sober house, so lock it up and stay tight inside of it. Jessica, again, who's, as I mentioned, always speaks poetically, once again closes out a scene with a rhyming couplet, and it's quite powerful. And the last lines of scene 5 are hers, and she says, "Farewell, and if my fortune be not crossed, I have a father, you a daughter lost." And so, we leave here potentially with this idea that Jessica knows this may be the last time she sees her father, as she abandons him, the faith, to run to a Christian. For what reason? Because she loves the Christian. Interesting. We really have not heard the words from Jessica that the reason she's going is because she loves Lorenzo so much. What we have heard is that she is very, very anxious to flee the house that she's in. So Jessica's motives here, I think, can come under question. Is Lorenzo simply an out for her to be able to escape the oppression of her house? Or is it that, in fact, she has fallen in love with him and really wants to run away? That really never becomes clear in this play. Um, so things to consider as we go forward. So that brings us to the end of this video lecture. In the next one, we're going to pick up here in Act 2 and continue on with Scene 6 to the end. So look forward to seeing you on the next one.